trip over my books here. All right. Well, welcome to another live streamed episode of From the Archives. This is the news segment. Before we get started with the actual episode, well, as if this isn't actually part of the actual episode, some updates from last week. Not really much to report other than I have an exciting announcement that I'll probably also reiterate during the quote recorded section of the podcast, or rather the scripted section. I think I'm going to do a charity drive sometime this summer. I got a new bike last October, and I am thinking about doing a century, which is 100 miles, or I guess you could do 100 kilometers on a bicycle. And the hope is to raise money while I'm doing the 100 miles. And the gimmick would be every year, or actually every mile is a year backwards in time. And I think I might do this every year. We'll see how the first one goes, because I think it could be fun. Call it like a time traveler charity tour or something like that, where the first year we'd do 2021 to 1921, and then if I did it again, I'd do 1920 to 1820, and then just keep going back in 100-year increments from the present. So it could be something fun. But I just thought I'd announce that. If you're on the Telegram channel already, or you follow me there, I made an announcement about that yesterday. So that's still developing. I mean, obviously we could be a few months out from that. And I still have to figure out how to put a camera on my bike, and then figure out how it's going to not lose all of its battery power while live streaming for the entirety of the 100 miles. We'll see how it goes. It could change through time, but I really liked the idea of doing a sort of charity drive where I bike 100 miles and then, I don't know, talk about 100 years of history during the bike ride. So for every mile, it's a year backwards in history. That could be a fun thing to do. Plus, there's a towpath. If you've never rode the Ohio and Erie towpath, it'd be an opportunity for you to check it out. And that's the main news for this week. I've got some books lined up, working on future episodes. It's been a lot of reading because, a lot of the books on my bookshelf I haven't read. So I've had to kind of start prepping more so in advance than I had in the previous, probably, what are we on, episode 13 now? So the previous episodes I've been able to either read the book well in advance, or I've already read the book many years ago. And so I kind of want to keep variety in the books that we're reviewing, but also, don't want to give myself too much work, so to speak. So I've got some stuff lined up, and something else that I'll have to do is, at least for this episode, is catch up on some stuff I missed from last week's episode, because there were like 4 or 5 coffee table books that turns out I forgot to grab when I was doing last week's episode that I need to wrap up in this week's episode. So that's really it for the news and announcements. I'm sure there will be developments. We are in the planning stages of getting a new bookshelf. So then I don't know. I enjoy my backdrop here, the way it's set up, but certainly a new bookshelf would be nicer than the hodgepodge that I have here, where we have, handmade bookshelf from shop class in high school, and then two Target bookshelves, and then what you can't really see off in the distance here is my grandfather's bookshelf that he built, and then another bookshelf that's behind the camera. So lots of different bookshelves. It'd be nice to have one consolidated bookshelf, so then we don't have books piled up everywhere. What's in the red picture frame? The red picture frame is actually projectile points. Those are reproductions that these are reproduction projectile points that I have acquired over the years. When you teach archaeology and do archaeology, people tend to end up either making projectile points for projects, or for research, or for fun when you're teaching stuff. So I cannot flint knap that well. Those are all made by someone else. And of course, me being an archaeologist, I don't want to hang up actual artifacts. because it just doesn't seem right for me to personally own any of them. So these are all reproductions of styles. So, I mean, granted, someone like myself who's sort of pretty knowledgeable in stone tools can tell you right away that these are all reproduction and not original artifacts, but I could see how, if you're not well versed in it, you might not realize that they're reproductions. But yeah, those are reproduction projectile points in the style of, thousands of years ago, Native Americans and American Indian cultures. And then this is a poster of different projectile point types. It's really hard to see, but it's a chronological typology chart. I don't know. It looks fun. My wife got it for me like almost a decade ago, and it's in a frame, so I like it. Yeah, that's basically it for the news and announcements section. We're going to get into this week's episode, making sure I haven't blocked out everything. Normally this is the segment that is scripted, so I have a short little intro that I do. All of this stuff for people who listen to the actual stuff on like Spotify or wherever you get the podcast, and you're not watching it on the live stream, this stuff gets edited out. So the news segment is just for people who watch it on the YouTube live stream. But with that being said, let's get rolling with this week's episode. Hey there, bibliophiles. Welcome to another episode of From the Archives, a book review podcast where I talk about a book from my library. I'm Eric Olson, a professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College, and welcome to my library. The books in my library are sometimes old, sometimes rare, sometimes normal, but always interesting. This podcast is recorded live at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on YouTube at Anthropology Archives. And every week I ask myself the following questions. Who wrote it? What's it about? What are people saying about it? And should you read it? Or should you can it? And since it's on my bookshelf, I need to decide whether I should can it or keep it, chuck it or cherish it, shelve it or shove it. Other ones that we've used are jettison or set it in. So other fun ones. That's this week's intro, which could have gone probably better if I had actually followed the script more precisely. But with all that said, let's take a look at a book from the shelf. And we have someone from the live stream asking a question. So your main research, if I can speak words here today. So your main research topic is projectile points. So for those listening in who didn't have the context in the news segment that I do on the live stream, before I start the recorded, edited part of the podcast, he was asking about something on or I'm assuming Dr. Monk is a he, it could be a she. Sorry, Dr. Monk was asking about some projectile points I have on my wall. My main research topic is archaeology. So a lot of the stuff on this podcast and this book review has to deal with anthropology and archaeology. So yeah, it's going to be projectile points, lithics, stone tools. That's my wheelhouse. Like that's my bread and butter. But I am not limited to just doing that kind of stuff. I mean, I teach intro to cultural anthropology. I teach intro to archaeology, teach an upper division cultural anthropology course. This summer I'll be teaching, again, another field school. So while, my main focus is archaeology and stone tools, I do cover a lot of different stuff. And since anthropology is the study of humans, there's pretty much everything is on the table in terms of topics that we could talk about. So yeah, great question, Dr. Monk, 1832. But anyway, back to this week's book. This week's book is The Hatchet's Blood, Separation, Power, and Gender in Ehing Social Life. I hope I'm saying that right. Or Ehing, E-H-I-N-G. And it's by Marc Schloss, written in 1992, published by University of Arizona Press. And this is basically a ethnography of a small group of people, roughly 2,500 people, in Southwestern Senegal. So this is on, west coast of Africa. And they're split between the Gabon, or the Gambia, sorry, not Gabon, the Gambia, Senegal, and Guinea-Bissau, or Bissau. I don't know how you properly pronounce that. I believe it's Portuguese. But that region of the world. And Marc Schloss is a professor. Well, now he's retired, but at the time he was an associate professor of anthropology at, I had to look this up where it was, Bucknell University. It rang a bell for me, but I couldn't quite place it. It's a private university in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, which is, I guess, like an hour and a half or 2 hours north of Harrisburg, so the state capital. So a small little, liberal arts college. It is now a sociology and anthropology department, but he's also retired as well. I couldn't really find much else about the guy, probably because he's, I'm guessing, older. A lot of his field work was from the 70s and 80s, and in fact, this book specifically takes place over the course of about a decade, from roughly the late 1970s, I think 1979, up to the late 80s, and then published in 1992. So basically a synthesis of his roughly decade of on and off again field work, where he's juggling teaching classes in the fall and the spring, and then spending most of his summer flying over to Africa in southwestern Senegal. So I really, what's this book about? I guess is the first thing to establish. I've kind of established that it's an ethnography, but it's kind of different than a few of the other ethnographies that I've talked about so far in previous episodes. I think the most notable one that I've reviewed so far is La Vida by Oscar Lewis. And this book is most assuredly different than La Vida because well, first off, it's only 150 or 160 pages. So in terms of length, I mean, it's like 1/6 of the length of La Vida. And it's also a different narration and writing style. So what you'll find when you're reading a lot of ethnographies by anthropologists is it's really wild how different ethnographies can be. So you can get something like La Vida, which is 600 pages, and it's just basically verbatim or paraphrasing of, daily life of people and, quoting them directly and not really providing context or a reflection by the author or interpretation. And then you get books like The Hatchet's Blood, which really Marc Schloss is synthesizing a decade's worth of research, and he's really giving you his perspective and his interpretation and providing a lot of references and citations, which you don't really get in La Vida or, arguably speaking, another one we've talked about on the podcast is Chinatown by Bernard Wong, which is from 82, so a decade before this, which is more sort of historical descriptive and not really personalized. I'd say it's closer in terms to Bernard Wong's style, where there's a lot of literature review, giving background information about other ethnographies in similar areas. But I really enjoyed reading this one, at least for the first, probably I'd say 2/3 of it. What kind of bothered me with it was that the last 50 pages, and I guess you could say the whole issue I had with it in general was the organization of the book. I find ethnographies tend to, at least standard practice is to give a lot of introductory information at the front load it with like your literature review, your research methods, sort of the cut and dry, bland historical descriptive stuff. Describing your research methods, describing like the environmental setting. But Marc Schloss kind of flip-flops that and jumps right into the more interesting stuff, talking about like Ehing, which is I believe I'm probably mispronouncing that as well, Odieng, which is, their word for, the Ehing word for hatchet, which is this spirit that takes the form of a hatchet. And it's really focused on that particular spirit and the rituals and behaviors that are related to it. And obviously he takes a deep dive into the context of rituals. He spends a lot of time talking about why they believe certain sicknesses or afflictions happen based on, committing taboos, which are called munyo, M-U-N-Y-O. And, it gives off this vibe very much of like a Clifford Geertz or Victor Turner, or more of your, like, I'd say classic symbolic anthropologist, or even like a Claude Lévi-Strauss kind of perspective of things, where it's very much focused on the symbolism, the patterns of ideology and beliefs, and how they influence cultural behavior, as opposed to probably, I would say, an antithetical, or not necessarily antithetical, but a counter sort of theoretical approach to Marc Schloss's perspective would probably be Robert Kelly's The Lifeways of Hunter-Gatherers, The Foraging Spectrum from 2013. I actually used this in my Peoples and Cultures class, the upper division anthro class. And Robert Kelly's book takes more of a human behavioral ecology approach, whereas Marc Schloss is very much in that sort of symbolic approach, where it's interpreting the symbolism of these beliefs and how they influence behavior, as opposed to, say, more of the nuts and bolts kind of like, what are the caloric intakes of rice, and what are the decisions that people make when spending 8 hours on a rice paddy harvesting versus, say, rice paddies are dictated by Ehing and the rights of women to own land versus the rights of men to own land. There's a lot to unpack with this book, and I think it provides an interesting viewpoint of the Ehing. Now, his interpretation leaves a little bit to be desired. Obviously, in 150 pages, I can't complain too much for a book that covers a lot of ground on a particular culture in such a short amount of time. But that being said, there was definitely, the anthropologist in me was left a little wanting in terms of like rigorous and systematic methodology. But I will say, but there's a big old caveat to this. I found it refreshing that Marc Schloss very much wore his shortcomings on his sleeve, and he was very honest about it. It felt very much relatable in the sense of he told stories about how he got lost in the middle of the woods and there's a giant monsoon happening, and he was worried he was going to miss the most important ritual of the year, the Kambutso, which is the circumcision ritual that they do. And there's a lot of stuff about blood in this book and the symbolism of blood. And it only happens once every 25 years, which, I mean, the Ehing have some very interesting, and since I focus mostly on native North America, I'm not used to this kind of perspective, especially Western African cultures, since it's not really something I spent a lot of time researching. It was really interesting to look at these rituals and find out, like, oh, they only do it once every 25 years. So these poor chaps, like, some of these kids are getting circumcised as, like, infants, because of just the way the timing of Kambutso was happening, while some people were like in their mid-20s and they were getting circumcised. And what's bonkers is they just take a knife and they circumcise you standing up naked in front of all your peers. And I mean, certainly, I guess I should temper my phrasing of bonkers because it's not very culturally sensitive. Obviously, we need to approach this as cultural relativity, but certainly as a male, it kind of shocked me to hear about this ritual. And I guess when I told Kristen about this, my wife, she she was like, well, what's most startling is that before you get this ritual, before you're circumcised, you're still viewed as a child amongst everyone else. So you can be in your mid-20s, but you're still not considered an elder in the community. So you have to go through this ritual. So once every 25 years, it's incredible that they're able to maintain this cultural continuity even though the ritual itself is so disjointed. I mean, a quarter century goes by before you have the next one. I think they said the last time they did Kambutso was 1956, and then the next time they did it when Marc Schloss was there was 1979, which is incredible that they can have this really long cyclical nature. So like I said, it's very, very different than the kinds of ethnographies I'm used to, at least in terms of particular rituals. But yeah, he kind of backloads it with the boring, kind of dry kinship studies and the environmental setting, which I think could have been a little bit more interesting if he was willing to give it a more systematic approach, whereas it's more sort of matter-of-fact, just stated the environmental settings. I do have a couple of quotes, though, that I wanted to pull from that I thought were kind of interesting. Yeah, so he talks about... Here's just one real quick thing that I mean, I'm not going to share everything with the book. I encourage you to read it on your own if you're interested in it. But some interesting things about like life and death and the cycle of life sort of gave off this very Eastern philosophy vibe of reincarnation, sort of how they don't really know their ancestry and lineage beyond, say, 3 or 4 generations, because the idea is those people are reborn into the next generation, and that's why names are recycled and reused again. And so here this passage is talking about why people must die and why people are born. And so here's a paraphrasing of Marc Schloss paraphrasing someone else, so take that for what you will. And God answered, "You said you didn't want people to die, but when a person dies, he comes back again. You give birth to him. Now, if you want that, let the old die. When they have died, the women will become pregnant." So it's just an interesting perspective on life and death and the soul cycle, as Marc Schloss puts it, and how it's a case of if you want to get pregnant, people have to die so that their souls can then come back into new births. But it also follows, if you want people to die, you have to give birth so that the cycle continues. So interesting stuff like that going on in the book. But what's interesting, or rather I should say frustrating, is there wasn't a whole lot of, I guess you could say, reviews that I could find online. So what are other people saying about it? Obviously, I gave it a very, very high review. I give this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's not the best. It's not the best ethnography, but it's also not the worst one you could do. I would say it's definitely easily approachable. 160-ish pages. You could probably crank this thing out over a weekend. It gets a little dry towards the end, so you might want to skim like the sections on kinship. But nonetheless, really informative, really interesting ethnography. So yeah, 3.5. I wouldn't say it's like a 4 or 5, mostly because it's not something that I feel like everyone should take a crack at in terms of ethnographies. If you have no interest in West African cultures, then maybe it's not the book for you. Maybe you might want to approach a book more like Things Fall Apart, which Marc Schloss actually talks about. Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. I think I'm mispronouncing his name. But that's more of a novelization of cultural anthropology and covers a lot of similar topics. I believe the setting for Things Fall Apart is in Ghana. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to double check that. But I definitely think, of the two, I'd probably recommend Things Fall Apart sooner, which eventually we'll have to review that. I'll probably want to read that one following reading this book. I want to reread Things Fall Apart and then compare the two. I think that'll be an interesting comparison since Marc Schloss mentions it. But I do have one review that I was able to fish out online. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any written reviews on Goodreads or Amazon. Amazon had nothing on this book. There were no Amazon reviews, or at least written reviews. There were Goodreads like star ratings, but there weren't a whole lot. There's only 4, so that tells you the readership of this book. Very, very niche. Like I said, books on this podcast are sometimes rare, but always interesting. But yeah, 4 reviews, 4.25 out of 5 stars. I'm gonna dip that review average down, unfortunately. But I was able to find a book review, as is typical with ethnographies, is they get another professor somewhere to write a book review. This one is by this one's by Richard Farden, and it's from 2009. That seems like such a late... That can't be right. Oh, no, it's June 1989. From the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies, Volume 52, Issue 2. The volume I have is 1992 is when it said it was published, but I think it's like the second reprint or something, so he might have edited some stuff since it was first published in 89. But this is what Richard Farden has to say about it. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's like 7 paragraphs long, because it's like an academic book review. But I think that first paragraph he gives kind of succinctly sums up a lot of how I feel about the book as well. In all the Ehing number 2,500, fewer than 2,000 of whom live in the 8 villages of Ehing country, where Schloss carried out his research. Even the Senegalese, it seems, either are unaware of the existence of the Ehing or fail to distinguish them from the majority Diola people of the region of Southwest Senegal, between Gambia and Guinea-Bissau, where both live. Ehing share with their neighbors a rice farming system that exploits the waters of the lower Casamance, I think that's how you pronounce that river, and in other ways, notably in ritual, which is the book's preeminent concern, have much in common with other peoples of the region. Schloss's book has valuable qualities. His argument is presented straightforwardly, and his field research is discussed with a refreshingly frank appraisal of its shortcomings, especially of the important events he did not, nor could not, witness. And I think, that's something that was really missing in some of these other ethnographies, like even Bernard Wong's ethnography, which kind of fits a similar mold of talking about informant interviews and talking about the information he's learned. He didn't really, Bernard Wong and likewise Oscar Lewis, didn't really give you that feeling of like personability, feeling like, oh, I can relate and empathize with the author. Because the important thing to remember is that Marc Schloss is this white guy going to, rural southwestern Senegal to study a black culture. And so he very much is a fish out of water in pretty much every sense of the word. And he really makes you appreciate his fish out of waterness, with stories about him getting lost in the woods in the middle of a monsoon at like 5 a.m. and worrying he was going to miss the Kambutso, was one that really stood out to me. But you don't really get that in Chinatown, and you don't really get that in La Vida. Definitely don't get that in La Vida, because Oscar Lewis isn't the one who did the research. It was Rosita Gonzalez. And if you want more about that book, go listen into that episode. I think that was episode 9 where I talk about La Vida. But yeah, it was refreshing and very frank, which I would call that, not to put on my professor cap, but that's what we would call reflexivity, where the ethnographer kind of looks back on their research and admits their caveats, their shortcomings, pitfalls of the research, where they could have done better. And I think that's really important of ethnographies, because it's important to realize when we read these cultural interpretations, we understand that this is the perspective of usually an outsider about another group, and understanding that they couldn't spend every waking minute of that decade that he spent researching the Ehing. He had to, be there roughly in the summer, and maybe, a few times. He didn't mention like his exact schedule, how many times he was there, but for the most part, he gave enough of a sense that basically every summer, when the academic semester ended in the spring, he was on a flight out to Senegal to work with the Ehing. And so certain times of the year he just couldn't be there because he had another job. He had to teach classes. And acknowledging that, I think, is really important in ethnographies. So it was a refreshing kind of perspective, refreshing read. I recommend it. 3.5 out of 5. Obviously Richard Farden doesn't have a numeric rating, but suffice to say, he recommends, if you're interested in study of West African cultures, then this is a good addition to the literature on West African cultures. So that's going to cover all of our bases for the Hatchet's Blood. I do have some old news to cover. Last week's episode on coffee table books, I stupidly forgot 3 books that were sitting right next to the pile of books that I was talking about, and I did not mention them. So they were America's National Parks. They are, I don't speak Swedish, but the title is Sweden in Swedish. Sfirid, I think, is what that is. And it's a book about Sweden. It's, quintessential coffee table book. It's got big old pictures with a couple of captions on the side, and then a little map showing you where in Sweden it is. Really pretty pictures. Makes me want to go back to Sweden and see more of Sweden that I didn't get to see in the one day I was in Stockholm. So obviously I didn't really get to see Sweden. But some really cool photographs. Honestly, comparing this to Franz Lanting, Jungles, which I talked about in last week's episode, the image quality of this is much better, and this book is like 25 years older than the book Jungles. And I don't know. I think this book does a better job of being a coffee table book. It's also thinner. It's also lighter than Jungles. So in my opinion, this is the quintessential coffee table book. Is basically a book about Sweden, and it's just pretty pictures of Sweden and then like a little description about where it is and, a little fun fact about it. So that's, a good coffee table book. And then one that we recently acquired, celebrating 150 years at Cedar Point, an amusement park here in Ohio. Also a pretty good coffee table book. It's got a lot of images, predominantly talking about, history of the park. So it shows you how the park's changed through time, different pictures and whatnot. So also a pretty good coffee table book in that regards. So I just wanted to throw those in because I missed them in last week's episode. Silly me, forgot to pick those up and talk about those as well. And I have to add those into the Google Sheet. So if you want to keep track of all the books that I've reviewed on this podcast, check out the Google Sheet. That's got the full list of all the different books. It's also got the list of the books that are in my book bin. So, I guess I really want to call the Google Sheet the book bin. But if there's any books that interest you, and I said I'm putting them in the book bin, that means they're up for grabs. So send me an email if you have questions, comments, concerns, or want a book from the book bin at anthropologyarchives@gmail.com. That way I'll, if you have questions, I'll read them on, the following episode or when I can. And, the book bin is available to whoever wants the books. Otherwise, they ended up donated to local charities, or if I don't think they're worth donating, I'll salvage the artwork. I know the episode on the early Americans, that one still hasn't been claimed yet, so I'm thinking probably to save space and recycle it, I'm probably just going to salvage the artwork on that one because it's a small book. But yeah, check out the book bin, see what kinds of books have already been reviewed if that interests you. Or just go listen to old episodes on anchor.fm or on Spotify or on, I think it's on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Wherever you listen to your podcast, it should be available because I use Anchor. And next week's episode is going to be Marshall Sahlins' Stone Age Economics, the 2017 edition with a foreword by David Graeber. So that's going to be next week's episode. And until then, be sure to follow me on Telegram if you want some occasional updates on the podcast and also other things that I'm doing, whether that's music for the video games that I've developed for my classes or other anthropology content. And check me out on anchor.fm, like I said. And until then, never stop reading.